Let's talk about one of the most stunning reversals in all of military history. Picture this, June 1942. The most powerful, most feared naval force on the entire planet sails confidently into what they think is a masterfully laid trap. But the trap isn't for their enemy, it's for them. This isn't just the story of a battle, it's an autopsy. It's the anatomy of a disaster that was, believe it or not, entirely preventable.
You really have to understand, after Pearl Harbor, Japan's grip on the Pacific was absolute. Their carrier fleet, the legendary Kido Butai, was this unstoppable force of nature. It had just spent 6 months tearing across the ocean, from Hawaii all the way to India, sinking everything in its path. They weren't just a navy, they were the undisputed masters of the sea.
I mean, just stop and think about that for a second. 350 years. Generations upon generations of nothing but victory. This goes way beyond simple confidence. This was a deep, baked-in cultural certainty that they were invincible. A mindset that would later get a name, a very fitting name, victory disease.
And that is the billion-dollar question, isn't it? How does a military force at the absolute peak of its power, with a track record like that, sail completely blind into an ambush that would not just cost them a battle, but would literally change the course of the Second World War forever? Well, that's what we're here to unpack. Now, you would think a plan as audacious as the one to attack Midway would be born from a place of overwhelming strength. But here's the first paradox. The whole operation was actually a desperate, high-stakes gamble, and it was driven not by confidence, but by a deep, gnawing anxiety at the very top of the Japanese high command. It really all started with what they didn't accomplish at Pearl Harbor. You see, for all the devastation, it was a strategic failure because America's aircraft carriers weren't there. They escaped. That left this lingering threat. Then, the Doolittle raid happened, American bombers hitting Tokyo itself. Now, militarily, it was a pinprick. But psychologically, it was a profound national humiliation. It put immense pressure on Admiral Yamamoto, the hero of Pearl Harbor, and it created this obsessive need to force one last, final battle to wipe the American fleet off the map for good.
And the man who felt that pressure more than anyone was the architect of the whole Pacific War, Admiral Yamamoto. This quote right here is absolutely chilling because it shows he knew something most of his colleagues refused to believe. Time was not on their side. He had lived in America, he'd seen its factories, its industrial might, and he knew that if this turned into a long, grinding war, Japan would be utterly crushed. He needed a knockout blow, and he needed it now.
So, his solution was Operation MI. It was this incredibly complicated, almost beautiful plan involving nearly 200 ships spread across the Pacific. But the core idea, it was deceptively simple. It was like setting a piece of cheese in a mousetrap. They would attack the tiny Midway Atoll, a place they knew the Americans simply could not afford to lose. And when the American carriers came racing to save it, Yamamoto's massive fleet would be waiting to spring the trap and annihilate them.
But here is the fatal flaw in the whole grand design. This entire intricate plan was built on a foundation of sand, a series of incredibly dangerous assumptions, all fueled by that institutional arrogance, that victory disease. It was a sickness that blinded them to reality and caused them to underestimate their enemy at every single turn.
Just look at this. The gap between what they believed and what was actually happening is just staggering. They assumed the Americans had 2 carriers, maybe. In reality, they had 3. They thought the USS Yorktown, heavily damaged just a month earlier, was out for months. But an army of 1,400 dock workers in Pearl Harbor, in an incredible feat of engineering, got her battle ready in just 72 hours. The Japanese believed their naval code was an unbreakable fortress. But in a basement in Hawaii, American codebreakers were reading their most secret messages like a daily newspaper. They were planning an ambush for an enemy they believed was demoralized, while sailing straight into a perfectly laid trap themselves.
And if you want to know how deep the hubris went, this is it. During their own war games to test the Midway plan, their own simulation, predicted disaster. The dice rolls showed American planes finding the Japanese carriers and sinking them. And what was the response from the senior officers running the game? They just overruled it. They literally said, no, that didn't happen, refloated the sunk Japanese ships, and kept playing. They were so convinced of their own superiority, they refused to even imagine a scenario where they could lose.
And so, one by one, every single system that could have warned them that they were walking into a trap failed. Their submarine picket line, which was supposed to be their eyes and ears, got to its station too late.
The American carriers had already sailed past. A key reconnaissance flight over Pearl Harbor got canceled because of a minor logistical problem. And even when their own radio intelligence picked up signs of increased American activity around Midway, the warnings were just brushed aside. The eyes of the fleet were completely, utterly blind.
So as the sun came up on the day of the battle, you have this deep strategic blindness. And now it's about to be compounded by a series of tactical mistakes and moments of pure, fatal indecision. What happens next is a cascade of errors, a domino effect, from which there would be no recovery.
Admiral Yamamoto, the commander on the spot, suddenly finds himself in an impossible position. First, he gets a message from his pilots attacking Midway. We need a second strike. Okay, so he orders his reserve planes, which are armed with torpedoes just in case enemy ships show up, to be rearmed with bombs for land targets. Then, a delayed report comes in from a scout plane. Enemy ships sighted. A few minutes later, the chilling confirmation, the enemy is accompanied by what appears to be a carrier. Suddenly, Yamamoto is trapped. Does he launch his half-ready planes now? Or does he recover his first wave, who are circling overhead and running out of fuel? He chose to follow doctrine, to recover his planes. It was the logical, by-the-book decision. And it was completely, fatally wrong. Because that single decision, it turned the hangar decks of his 4 massive aircraft carriers into ticking time bombs. In the mad rush to switch from bombs back to torpedoes, all safety protocols went out the window. You have live munitions stacked everywhere. You have planes dripping with high-octane fuel. You have fuel lines running all over the decks. His carriers were perfectly primed for an absolute catastrophe, just waiting for a single spark. And that spark was about to arrive from the sky. What happens next? It all unfolds in this incredibly brief, violent, and utterly decisive window of time. We're talking about 5 minutes. Just 5 minutes that didn't just decide the battle, but literally changed the entire world.
The first American attacks were, frankly, a slaughter. Squadron after squadron of old, obsolete torpedo bombers flew in low and slow, straight into a buzzsaw of anti-aircraft fire and Japanese Zero fighters. They were torn to pieces. Almost all of them were shot down. Not a single one of their torpedoes scored a hit. But their incredible, suicidal sacrifice was not in vain, because it had a critical, unforeseen consequence. It dragged every single defending Japanese fighter plane down from high altitude right down to the waves to deal with the threat.
And at that exact moment, miles above the chaos, arriving completely unseen and totally unopposed, were the American dive bombers. With the Japanese fighter cover lured out of position, they had a clear, unimpeded run at the carriers below. And in just 5 minutes, literally from 10:22 to 10:27 in the morning, they delivered a knockout blow that ended the fight. Those American bombs plunged through the flight decks and into those chaotic hangar bays we just talked about, igniting all that fuel, all those unsecured bombs and torpedoes. The result was apocalyptic. The carriers Kaga, Akagi, and Soryu were instantly transformed into raging infernos. In less time than it takes to drink a cup of coffee, the very heart of the Imperial Japanese Navy had been ripped out and destroyed.
But the fight wasn't quite over. Aboard the last surviving Japanese carrier, the Hiryu, a fiercely aggressive admiral named Yamaguchi launched 2 desperate, beautifully executed counterattacks. His pilots found and crippled the American carrier Yorktown, which later sank. It was this final, defiant act of the samurai spirit. Shortly after, the Hiryu was found and destroyed itself, and Yamaguchi, true to his code, chose to go down with his ship.
The battle was over. The defeat was total. But for the Japanese government and military, the truth was so catastrophic, so utterly unthinkable, that they decided it simply could not be admitted. And what followed this military disaster was a moral one, a systematic, cold, and brutal campaign to hide the truth from everyone.
The cover-up was meticulous. The survivors were picked up, immediately isolated, and sworn to absolute secrecy under threat of death. The wounded were hidden away in special hospital wards as secret patients, forbidden from even contacting their own families. And most of the surviving expert pilots, the most valuable asset they had left, were immediately shipped off to distant, dangerous fronts where their priceless experience was just thrown away. And back in Tokyo, the government announced a smashing victory at Midway. People celebrated in the streets having absolutely no idea what had really happened.
And this lays bare the true, staggering cost of that hubris. 4 of Japan's best aircraft carriers gone. These are the ships that had led the attack on Pearl Harbor. Over 3,000 men were lost. But even more critically, That number included Japan's most experienced combat pilots and the irreplaceable maintenance crews. Japan's industry could eventually build new ships, but it could never replace those men. The Americans lost one carrier, the Yorktown. It was one of the most lopsided and decisive naval victories in all of history.
And in the end, nobody understood the real reason for the disaster better than the man who had planned the whole thing. In a private letter, not for public consumption, Yamamoto wrote this brutally honest assessment. It wasn't bad luck. It wasn't the fog of war. It was arrogance. It was hubris. We underestimated and overestimated. In a way, they had defeated themselves long before the first American bomb ever fell.
And that's what brings this story right back to us, right here, right now. Because Midway is so much more than just a historical event. It is a timeless, universal warning about the incredible danger of success. It forces us to look in the mirror and ask some hard questions. What is our own personal victory disease? In our jobs, in our businesses, in our own lives, what fatal assumptions are we making today simply because we've been successful in the past?